welcome. If you're just dropping in here, we're going to take about 2 minutes just to do quick introductions, housekeeping, make sure you know how to navigate the next hour or so, and let a few people drop in. We have about a third of the registrants dropped in currently. So this is obviously Dan Nicholson. Anybody here probably knows him more than they know me. And we're gonna break down this process. We got New Year's coming up, and Dan talks about all the time. We have this thing that we do where we go, hey, we're gonna change our life, and then we vacillate between rigidity. It's too rigid, so we go into chaos. My background is fitness, way back in the day, and what we call that is yo-yo dieting. It's basically how to not yo-yo diet your budget, which I'm sure if you've tried to do any kind of finance, any kind of strict budgeting, you've run into that before, where a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you're doing okay, and then you kind of lose track of stuff, and then it becomes restrictive, and then you don't have a way to adapt accordingly, and basically say, you know what, forget it. We're not going to, I can't do this anymore, it's not working for me. Maybe go way off the rails, come back, go way off the rails again, but that undulation, that volatility ends up not looking the way you want it to at the end of the year. So real quick, what we're going to do is we're going to get a nice clean recording of this, and we will send it out depending on the Q&A. We want to make sure that we get your questions answered, and if they're personal questions or they're private questions, those will not get sent out in any kind of replay. So I want you to feel comfortable knowing that. That being said, if you have questions throughout this, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. Put your questions there. There's a chat. You can chat it up in there. I might be over here and chatting with you a little bit, but put your Q&A, your questions in the Q&A box so that at the end, as time allows, we can just go through them and make sure you get the most out of this next 45 minutes or hour. Now, the primary question that Dan and I have been working on, and he has more experience specifically with business and finance than I do with this, is there seems to be people that win all the time. They just seem to be lucky. That's the language I always use, is like some people just always seem to be lucky, and other people always kind of seem to get the shorter end of the stick. And from a marketing and a behavior standpoint, I spent probably the last 5 or 6 years really deep diving into why is this, and then from a business, finance, kind of investing standpoint, not that that's what Dan does, but you'll learn about the investor frame and stuff. There's actually a reason why some people just seem to keep winning, and some people maybe win once and then never again, or can't seem to win at all. So we're going to spend the next 45 minutes breaking that down and introducing the frames, the thinking systems, and I believe the step-by-step process on how to set up your finances to avoid this yo-yo budgeting, right? This chaos rigidity loop. So pass it off to, he doesn't call himself this, I call him this, the wealth wizard, Dan Nicholson.
No, that's true. I definitely do not refer to myself as the wealth wizard, but I appreciate when Nick does. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm super excited to break this down. We've got a lot to cover in 45 minutes because this is extracted from a much bigger program called Cash Flow Engineering, which we're teaching live right now, and that's a 6+ week program with lots of different modules to it. So we're taking an excerpt really of that and several pieces of that to try to make it as impactful for you as possible in 45 minutes. So let's dive right in to 3 steps to improving your finances by 80% plus. And as a little bit of kind of foreshadowing, over the last 10 years, 10 plus years at this point, I've had somewhere, because I did the math a couple weeks ago, somewhere north of 3,000 unique conversations, with unique in the sense of 3,000 individual either business owners or people who would fit into the definition of high net worth. So somewhere around 300 a year. And there is a universal problem in the conversations that I have in the context of wealth, financial certainty. There's a universal problem that I'm being asked to solve. Now, the language that's used it varies from person to person in terms of how they articulate it. But really, it can be boiled down to these questions. Am I going to be okay? Which underneath that is basically, am I going to run out of money? Now, it may be hard to relate to the person who's got hundreds of millions of dollars in their bank account. That how could they possibly be asking the question, am I going to be okay, or am I going to run out of money? But the reality is, and we'll talk about some of this today, the reality is Parkinson's law: as people make more, they spend more. And so they just keep upping their lifestyle. So you go from making 50,000 to 100 to a million, so on and so forth. Your spending keeps going up and up and up. You keep taking on more liabilities. And so, yeah, you may have a bunch of assets, but you want to maintain a lifestyle. It's called loss aversion. Once you get to a certain place, you don't want to go back to where you were before. And so loss aversion steps in, and there is an overall fear of, am I going to be okay? Am I going to run out of money? And ultimately, or in other words, it's about uncertainty. And that's really what I've spent the last 10 years and arguably the last 20 years of my career, if I include my time at the accounting board when I was working on derivatives and hedge accounting standard. Derivatives and hedging is about risk. And then corporate finance on portfolios ranging from 5 to 100 billion. We're also thinking a lot about risk. So even before I was running nth degree CPAs, which is we're focused on purpose-driven entrepreneurs, and not the big corporations, uncertainty has been sort of the thing that I've dealt with the most in my career. So I've been sort of trying to figure out how can I take what I learned in corporate finance and apply it to the individual, that purpose-driven individual, that purpose-driven entrepreneur running a business that's maybe 6 figures to 7 or 8 figures. How can I apply what I've learned to help eliminate uncertainty for those folks? And so I heard this equation a couple years ago from Chip Conley, and it sort of stopped me in my tracks. It's this equation: anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. I like to repeat that in hopes that it settles in. Anxiety can be deconstructed into two pieces: uncertainty and powerlessness, and there's a multiplication there on purpose because they amplify each other. There's not a plus sign, it's a multiplicative scenario. So if we have any amount of uncertainty and any amount of powerlessness, they're feeding each other. And it stopped me in my tracks because, again, I've spent the last really 20 years trying to understand uncertainty, and the last 10 years trying to understand uncertainty and apply it to the purpose-driven entrepreneur. And then it struck me, and I heard this equation, and the math nerd in me, I think it's the distributive property, just drop in financial. Financial anxiety equals financial uncertainty times financial powerlessness. Like there it is. And so, jump back here for a second. So if we are to ultimately try to reduce the anxiety, that feeling, or that question of, am I going to be okay? Then what we need to do is drive down uncertainty and drive up the power that we have over our finances. So that's ultimately the game that we're playing. Accounting, finance, tax, and key performance indicators and budgets and all those things, those really should be tools that are what? Giving us more certainty and giving us more power. That's what they should be doing. Are they really? Well, I'm going to talk about that. But first, I want to talk about, as prefacing remarks, this idea of what we think will happen, which is we think that over time we're going to have more cash flow. Now, in my cash flow engineering program, we spend an entire module explaining to people what cash flow actually is, because a lot of people don't understand it's not revenue. It's not necessarily profit. It's really a function of changes in your balance sheet, changes in your assets, liabilities, and equity. So a lot of people don't even ever look at their balance sheet, and they only look at their P&L, and so that's why they could have revenues going up, profits going up, and their bank account going down. because they're reinvesting those funds, or any number of things that can happen. And so we unpack kind of what cash flow actually is, and it's important to understand that, but we assume that over time we're just going to make more. I hear it in various shapes and forms, the way that it gets expressed by business owners and individuals, but they think that if I just work harder, it's sort of the almost hustle mentality that exists, which is, well, if I just keep working at it, by virtue of just showing up every day, the consequence of that action is that I'll have more. Right? That's the assumption, right?
Can I preemptively plant a seed real quick?
Of course.
It's kind of intuitive, maybe not. When you look at this, you say what we think will happen in this graph. I'm just going to plant the seed because I think we're going to circle back to it. But anytime, let's say you did, $84,000 a month, and you say, now I'm on a 7-figure run rate. That's a version of what you're looking at here, and I just want to plant that seed because I think people might say, I don't assume that's going to happen. But if you've ever said, I'm on this kind of run rate, this is what's happening, right? You assume you're going to just kind of maintain or keep this trajectory. So just plant that seed because I know we're going to come back to it, but that's what it looks like. And, it looks a lot of ways, but that's what it can look like in real life.
That's right. So we think cash flow will keep going up, but then we face reality, which is if you've been in business for any amount of time, or you've looked at your personal finances in any amount of detail, you know that you have these peaks and valleys with your cash flow. So we've got sort of reflected now in gray on the chart that we've got awesome, cash is going up, everything is great. Oh crap, our balance is down. Oh shoot, we're almost out of money here. Oh no, now we've got a bunch of money. So there's all these kind of ups and downs that I see in business and individual bank accounts. And hopefully there's a positive trend line. Hopefully it all is averaging out to, or if you graphed over a long period of time, that's trending upwards. Often that is not the case. Usually that's not the case. Maybe revenues is trending up, but there's the same amount or less in cash. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which we talk about in great detail in the course. Things like the highest month paradigm, which is something we've observed in the data about what people do after they reach their highest month. The thing that is going up at an exponential rate in the businesses, the 3,000 plus unique conversations that I've had with businesses and individuals, is risk. Risk. The probability that something bad might happen is going up exponentially. That's what risk is, the probability that something bad might happen. How does it show up? Well, usually it shows up in the fire drills, the sleepless nights, the getting further away from the things that you actually want, all of the cognitive dissonance that you experience. You just haven't labeled the risks that actually exist in your business. And again, we deconstruct this in the course to how to identify, label, compile, analyze, strategize, and execute around your risks and how to eliminate them. Because until we start having a framework to eliminate risk, we're always going to have this volatility in our cash flow. So that's the nefarious thing lurking around the corner that we're not aware of. So what do we do about it? Well, as Nick in his opening remarks said, why is it that some people always seem to win and others seem to lose? Is it luck? Are the people who are winning just smarter? Are the people who are losing have some sort of defect that's preventing them from being successful? What is it? Well, we've got all this data intuitively around how friends who are really well researched and they have all the credentials that are losing. How is that possible? They have all the credentials, they're doing all the research, and they can't seem to get any traction in their business. And then we see somebody else who keeps burning the boats, going all in, betting everything, and then they win. What's going on with that? And then later, the same person who burned the boats, who had a bunch of wins, now has a massive loss. What's the disconnect? What's going on? Well, I've been asking these questions of myself as an entrepreneur, as a serial entrepreneur. Yes, I have an accounting firm, but I've been an entrepreneur really my entire life and own and have owned many different businesses. So I've been asking myself these same questions. How could I do all the research, seemingly have all the credentials, have one idea, go gangbusters, have another idea, totally fail? How is that possible? So I've studied this, I've looked at the data, and this quote stands out to me. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. Now there's some, if you Google this quote, you'll see that it's not clear who should properly be given attribution for that quote, but this is the most prevailing. W. Edwards Deming gets the most amount of credit for it. But it's the idea that if you keep failing, you perfectly designed a system that's going to generate that result. If you keep having ups and downs, one win and then a loss, then another win, then a loss, guess what? The system's perfectly designed for those outcomes. So why don't we build a system, rig the game to win, that's going to get us the outcomes that we want? And when I say outcomes, I mean a range of outcomes. One is going to be the home run, but one might be, not what I wanted, but I'm still okay with it. It's called hedging, removing the downside risk. We want only outcomes that we're going to be okay with. We need to remove the outcomes that we're not okay with. We need to build a system that's going to enable us to do that. So let's start by studying what those who seem to have the systems in place to win, what are they doing? And again, in our masterclass, Cash Flow Engineering, we spend an entire day on this. So I'm going pretty briefly through this. But one, they've identified their biases. They inherently know that we as humans, system one, system two, system one is the fast brain that allows us to not have to think about moving our hands and not have to think about moving our legs to walk across the street. We make thousands or hundreds of thousands of subconscious decisions on any given day. System one brain does that, enables us to do that. System two is this slow plotting part of our brain that's working through math equations, strategizing, etc. Well, system one, for it to be able to process like any system quickly, is got some level of biases. And if you look at the neuroscience and research, you find that even if you're aware of biases, things like anchoring bias, pricing bias, so on and so forth, even if you know about all of them, you're still subject to them. It's called the G.I. Joe bias. And even if you know about the G.I. Joe bias, you're still subject to that. So they exist. And so we can't necessarily turn them off. But we need to identify them, determine the ones that we are prone to fall victim to, and then implement a system to hedge that risk, that I might fall victim to the anchoring bias, the pricing bias, the recency bias, loss aversion. Most fall victim to loss aversion. The difference between a mediocre trader and an exceptional trader is typically that the exceptional trader is willing to lock in losses faster than the marginal trader. Well, doesn't that seem counterintuitive? Why would you lock in losses? How would that make you exceptional? Because they understand that if I lock that in, that loss, I can take that money and reallocate it to something that's going to grow faster. So maybe we're subject to that kind of loss aversion in a big way, and it's causing us to make the wrong decision. So they've identified their biases. They were eccentric before they had money. In other words, they played their game. You hear about the eccentric billionaire all the time, and it's said in sort of this almost lovingly way, oh, they're just eccentric. They didn't just become eccentric when they became a billionaire. Jeff Bezos, last looked, Amazon stock price, he's worth something like 175 billion. If you study his history going back 20 plus years in Seattle, he had some non-conventional ways of thinking about stuff. Now you might say, oh, he's eccentric, or Elon Musk had some non-conventional ways of thinking about things way before he was running PayPal, Tesla, etc. And so they're playing their game. And then lastly, they're carrying a toolbox and a different toolbox, meaning they have principles, frameworks methodologies for evaluating scenarios. So they in and of itself, they have a toolbox, a framework, and it's typically a different framework. It's not conforming to the standard. Again, because they're okay with being eccentric, and they've identified their biases, and they know that, hey, this thing I'm learning about marketing right now, where I'm being told that there's only one way to do things, you can only do high ticket or you can only do low ticket. Well, they know that in and of itself is an overgeneralization or all or nothing thinking, and those are bias, cognitive distortions that are going to cause us to make potentially the wrong decisions. So they carry a different toolbox. Nick, anything you want to add on to that?
No, I mean, that's pretty well summed up. I think just the point about being eccentric and carrying a different toolbox and identifying all three of them, it just it's a case for kind of marching to really understand yourself and then marching to the beat of your own drum, which is we talk about that in Cash Flow Engineering and in your book as well.
And with that, we have to build our own system, the system that is going to allow us to identify our biases, allow us to play our game, and it's going to come with a toolbox so that we can make the right decisions based off our biases and based off who we are. And so I built that system, and it starts with the 4 commandments of wealth acceleration. They're basically the underlying assumptions that are going to drive this methodology. And if you tried to build a system before, you have to make a certain baseline set of assumptions inherent in the system that you're building. You have to tell it what you're optimizing towards. And so I have 4 key assumptions. Now, we don't have time to go through all of them. And again, in the course, we go through each commandment, and we show you how it impacts cash and how it impacts risk. So we don't have the time to go through that level of detail. But I'm going to share with you 2 that are key to optimizing your finances without a budget, which is what this webinar is ultimately about and what we're driving towards. Commandment number 1, perhaps the most important, because the other 3 kind of build off this, is that every action we take is intended to get us closer to what we want. Now, your default right now is probably more is the solution to everything. More sales, right? I got an email actually from my coach. I don't know if he's watching right now, but one of my coaches on the accounting firm side that said, sales is the answer to everything. It's like, I actually could not disagree with you more, because if you go all in on sales and the number one thing you want is more time, then you got further away from the things that you want. If the thing you need right now is more time. So more sales, more clients, more leads, more employees, more office space, more vehicles, more inventory is not necessarily the answer, because it depends. What does it depend on? It depends on what you want. You have to actually define it. Now, most of us don't end up defining their priorities, because when you define your priorities or the things that you want, you're defining success. And folks are reluctant to define success, and I'm stealing this a bit from Nick, because when you define success, you're also simultaneously defining failure. So if you're absolutely stuck in a loss aversion state, and one of your biases is loss aversion, then you're going to avoid defining your priorities because you're trying to avoid failure, not meeting those, somehow defining them and not hitting the deadlines. Or, and we'll talk about this later, stuck in a maximized mindset rather than an optimized mindset. I'll get into that in a bit more detail. But we have to define what we want. I call them profit priorities. We built an app for it, actually. It's called the Certainty app. If you notice, there's a trend. Certainty is in kind of everything that I do. And when we define our profit priorities, we say, what do we want? What do we want? When do we want it by? And how much will it cost to fund the thing that we want, or the things that we want? Because what we've done is we've taken this multivariable equation, what we want, and we've defined the variables. We've given them, we've set a dollar amount, we set a timeline. And then once we have that, we can solve for how much more we actually need. So we've taken this whole broad thing of I need more, but we've never actually defined how much more, because you can't define how much more you need if you haven't defined what you want, how much it costs to get it, and when you want it by. So every action needs to get closer to what we want. In other words, closer is greater than more. We're going to bias towards closer to what we want rather than biasing towards more as the solution to everything. Nick?
I will just challenge anybody that thinks this might not apply to them or it seems intuitive. I'm just going to repeat what Dan said. People won't do this because if success to you is, I want to be home by dinner for my family, and you say that out loud, you are then potentially in your mind a failure every time you don't do that. Right? So it's much easier to hide behind whatever labels, 7-figure business, 8-figure business. So just challenge you to really define success. And that just, then we got to get closer to making sure we're home by dinner every night, right? Instead of just driving for more things that, again, we can hide behind to convince our peers that we're successful.
Yeah. That leads into commandment number 2 of 4, which is that most business decisions, 80% or more, probably closer to 100% if you're a purpose-driven entrepreneur, are preference-based decisions. Preference-based, meaning what you want. They are not binary. Most are looking at it as if somehow they're binary. Hey, I'll get these questions from a finance perspective. Hey, should I hire more employees? Should I invest in marketing? Should I get this office space? It's like, well, I can tell you what the numbers are, whether or not you can afford it, but it's actually a preference, because one person could say they want to grow their business, and another person could say, I want a lifestyle business that allows me to travel. I don't want to grow it more than where it already is, because it's going to get in the way of me being able to travel. And so both of those folks are actually correct. They could have the same exact business model, serve the same exact clients, and one could want to grow and another could not, and both would be correct, which means that they're not binary. They're preference-based. In other words, if they were binary, if business was just composed or comprised of binary-based decisions, then you would go on Google. I wouldn't be needed. Our CPA firm would be out of business. Just about every single other consulting firm business would be out of business, because you would just go to Google and you would type in, should I hire somebody right now? And then the algorithm would be like, yes, go hire someone. Should I invest in marketing? Oh, and then yes or no, right? It would be ridiculous to think that we could go to Google and get the answers to these questions. And the reason is that they are preference-based. It depends on what you want. So back to commandment 1. So those are the core 2 commandments for solving the baseline issue of budgeting. So let's kind of dig into it a little bit more. We have our commandments, and then we have our principles and frameworks. These are things that we're going to apply to try and work through a preference-based issue. Again, it's not binary. So if things are not binary, we don't need rules. Well, if you don't have rules, what do you have? You have principles. Accounting standards are principle-based because there's too many it depends. So if you have a hard, fast rule to something that depends, you're going to get the wrong answer because it doesn't work. So frame number 1 to thinking about your finances, and in particular your budgeting, is what I call the parenting frame. Now I have 2 kids. They will be 5 and 7 soon, here in January. My oldest daughter each day is doing she's doing 2 countdowns right now. The countdown to Christmas and then dual track countdown to her birthday. So first thing she says at the breakfast table every morning is only X number more days till my birthday, and then the next day I get the next countdown. So anyhow, 2 kids, and as a parent, what do I want to do? More than anything, I want to prevent bad things from happening to my kids. Bad things. Now, it'd be great if good things happened, right? I want them to be fulfilled and have humility and other attributes. And more than anything, I want to make sure that they're okay, that nothing bad happens to them. So when I think about them watching Netflix on their iPad, what do I want to do? I want to enact a preventative control, meaning I want to set up Netflix so they can't watch rated R movies. They're 4 and 6, soon to be 5 and 7. I don't want them to watch PG-13 movies. And maybe there's other select things I don't want them to watch because I don't like the message, right? Which is a preference, right, to some degree. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to lock down Netflix to prevent something bad from happening, finding out later that they've been watching these rated R movies. Preventative. So if I'm trying to prevent something bad from happening, that's greater than detective. Detective would be I find out later, I get some report from Netflix, I get an email, hey, here's your, I don't know if this is a thing, but hey, here's a rundown of the shows that your kids have been watching. And then I look at it and I go, oh, they just watched, it turns out Die Hard is also their favorite Christmas movie. I wish they wouldn't have been watching it because they're 4 and 6, right? That's detective. That's finding out after the fact that something bad has happened. So we want to bias preventative over detective. Secondly, we want to set up situations where we opt into something rather than opting out. It's kind of in the same family of preventative versus detective. Opting in is I have permission. So if my daughter comes to me, which my oldest daughter often asks, Dad, are you okay if I watch this? She's a rule follower. Are you okay if I watch this? I get the chance to opt in. Maybe I have to type in a code so that she can. I'm opting in. Opting out is having to take some action after the fact. I have to go and cancel my credit card, or I have to go ask for a refund, or I have to tell the software as a service provider, stop charging me. I have to opt out. Well, what takes more cognitive load, opting in or opting out? Well, opting out does, because you have to take action for the bad thing to stop happening. Whereas with opting in, you have a choice from the front end. Something bad isn't happening that you have to stop. You get to decide whether this thing happens or not. So we need to adopt a frame, a mindset when we're looking at our finances. Again, every system is perfectly designed to produce the outcome that it's currently generating. We have to design the system so that we're preventing bad things from happening. And so we get to opt in. So maybe we opt in to spend more than what we planned. That's better than opting out, which is finding out later that something's happened. So what happens in corporate finance? Well, corporate finance has a whole team of folks, right? In a big organization, each business unit has their own finance team, right? And within that finance team, they've got FP&A, financial planning and analysis. So the people who are doing the budgets and tracking and forecasting and all that. That's their job, right? And so when you want to buy something as a business leader, what do? You have to submit a requisition to ask, hey, I need to get approval for this spending item, right? So what do? They go and they look and they go, is this in the budget or not? And they decide. That's preventative. So corporate finance has a lot of preventative controls in place, right? In our individual finances, what preventative controls do we have in place? Usually the answer would be none, because we're wrestling with ourselves. We're having an internal tug of war where we're deciding whether or not we're going to approve our own actions. And depending on the biases that we have, our state of being in that point in time, we may not actually be preventing. So again, we have to design a system independent of ourselves that is going to get us the outcome that we want. So that's frame number one. And then we have this issue processor, which is we're going to bias optimize over maximize. Now maximize, this occurred to me 3 or 4 years ago. My friend Alan Anderson, he's a leadership, he coaches a lot of executives, advises a lot of executives, and he was talking to me about goal setting and this idea that we want to build from a position of optimize up to maximize, and most do the opposite. And it occurred to me in that moment why almost every financial construct that's being applied to big business is not working for small business. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. If you run a Fortune 500 company or you work in a Fortune 500 company, you actually have one job, one job. And it's the same for all of you, which is to what? Maximize shareholder value. You might have said, well, no, my job is CEO, or my job is marketing director, or I'm a computer scientist in this organization. No, your job is, you have a fiduciary responsibility as a CEO to maximize shareholder value. What does maximize mean? Maximize means have the most. You want to have the most now. Most of everything today. The most amount of employees, most amount of revenue, most amount of profit, most amount of assets. And we can work towards that because we have potentially economies of scale. If you're a Fortune 500 company, you have all these divisional finance departments. And I often give the example of when my wife was in corporate recruiting at Starbucks, there was a group within IT whose job was just to support their recruiting application, right? They're maximizing. In most of our small business world, we couldn't even imagine having an IT person dedicated to one of our softwares, right? Certainly not at that level. So you're maximizing for shareholder value. We're not maximizing for what the shareholders want beyond just more money, because we've got thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of shareholders. So we couldn't ask each individual shareholder, hey, what do you want? What are your priorities? So we have to default to just giving them more. As a individual or business owner, we can't maximize. We don't have the resources. We don't have the time. We don't have the money. We don't have the staff. We have to optimize. Optimize is what is the most efficient path forward. It's a totally different framework when you realize that you're trying to maximize, when you only are able to optimize. So this is where budgets fundamentally fall down, because budgets are about maximizing. You put together in detail what you're going to spend per month. You line it all out. You make all these assumptions, right? And you get the budget together. I used to do this for folks, small business owners. They tell me they want a budget. We put it all together, and then they never look at it. And I go, why didn't you look at this budget? I assumed, my default is usually to assume I didn't communicate something very well. What's going on? Why are you not looking at this budget? Well, it's basically BS. It's just a bunch of assumptions that we made. We just made up numbers because we don't really have any data. And 1 month or 3 weeks after we put it together, all the data was wrong because the assumptions, everything changed, or we pivoted the business, or who knows what. So you maximize is you try to really sharpen your pencil and get these exact numbers, and you do it in painstaking detail. You have every single account, and you put in, this one we pay it in March and in July, so we got to put in those numbers then, and you do all this stuff, and then you get to the end of it, and it doesn't actually get you any closer to the things that you want because it's built on a house of cards. So we have to optimize. So with that, I want to talk about how we actually fix this problem. Here's the usual flow of income versus expenses. So the line is basically flat. Is for most of us, the income going into our personal accounts is fairly flat. If we work in a W-2 job, maybe when we see little blips once a quarter or so, maybe we get a bonus or stock grant, or we take a draw from our business. But the income that's actually going into our personal accounts is usually pretty flat, right? But then our expenses are all over the place. Back to the comment I was saying before, when people are trying to maximize and build out this detailed budget, they're trying to map, okay, when are we going to have this expense? What quarter is it going to fall in? So on and so forth. So it's all over the place. And so when something is all over the place, what does that represent? Represents volatility, right? In simple terms, though, the higher the volatility, the greater the risk, right? So volatility is a measure of helping us determine risk. So when our expenses are all over the place, we have a high amount of risk of running out of cash, not being able to save, having to track, having to keep going back and updating our budget. And these are all detective controls, right? The budget that you're using, you're going back at the end of the month and going, or the end of the week, and going, have I spent too much? Oh crap, I spent too much. Nothing prevented you from spending too much other than yourself. Nothing systematically prevented that from happening. You had to find out later. Detective control. Detective control, we're trying to avoid. We're trying to implement preventative controls. So what is the ideal state? The ideal flow of income and expense? Well, again, we usually have the sort of relatively flat line. Now, of course, if income was going up, that's great. What we want, though, is for our expenses to be as flat as possible. Why? Because now we show that we have very little volatility. Less volatility, less risk that we're going to run out of money, right? So what happens when the expense line goes from being all over the place to being flat? Well, now we have an expected amount of savings each month. Just the difference between our income and our expenses. It's determinable, right? We know each month if our income is flat and our expenses are flat, we know, hey, I should be saving. Say our income is 10 grand a month, our expenses are 8 grand a month. I know every month I should be saving 2 grand. If my income goes up, then I'm going to be saving more than 2 grand, right? So ideally we have this flat line of expenses because then we're eliminating the volatility. So we need to design a system then that allows us to straight line our expenses so we don't have that crazy curve, the crazy volatility month to month, which causes us to just ignore it, right? We just tune it out. We stop opting in over time and we stop, we don't have any of the preventative controls to begin with. So we want to get our expenses, our outflows, to be a straight line. And if we do that, we've rigged the game to make it really easy to know how much we can save and how much we can allocate towards investments or towards funding the things that get us closer to what we want. So why don't we do that? Why don't we do that? And it's a 3-step process. Step 1 is to compile the data. Compiling is part of our what we call case framework: compile, analyze, strategize, execute. 4 weeks of our cash flow engineering series is teaching you how to compile, analyze, strategize, and execute after you've learned the full kind of operating system of Wealth Commandments and principles and frameworks. But we start with compile. Where are we at currently? Google Maps doesn't work if you don't tell it the correct current location and the correct final destination. So we have to know where we're at currently. Then we assign the data and we automate it. So I'm going to break that down a little bit more for you. So what exactly are we compiling? And we're going to give you a workbook. You can get it in the Cash Flow Engineering series for sure. We have a lot of workbooks to do the heavy lifting for you, but we're going to give you a workbook because we want to compile the income and expense data for the last 12 months. The last 12 months. So we're recording this in the start of December. So I'm looking back a rolling 12 months. So if I did this in March, I would use March back 12 months. So not calendar year, the last 12. Why? Because your behavior is changing. And so if you're looking back just the previous calendar year, that's not really reflective of your current pattern. So we always want to look back the last 12 months, not the previous calendar year. And so I've done this with my wife, who's not a finance person. And we do this with our personal side of things. We do this in detail with our business at a much finer level because we're doing the whole cash flow engineering process. But I just take my expenses and I dump them into a spreadsheet. I just dump them all in. Just download them from the bank accounts. I dump them in. And I'll tell you in the next slide what we're going to do with it. But I just download the last 12 months. I dump it into a spreadsheet. And then I map out our profit priorities. Where are we at currently? What are the things I'm trying to get closer to? And we have a workbook for that, but we also have the Certainty app, which allows you to do this at a much more real-time way, in the sense that it connects to your bank accounts and it's going to update and show you the progress. How are you actually getting closer to the things that you want? But we have 2 types of profit priorities. the things we're trying to get closer to. Our core priorities, the things that everyone has, paying off debt, funding reserves, fully funding your retirement, or if you're an entrepreneur, having enough money where you don't have to work. Doesn't mean you won't, but often entrepreneurs have a slightly different definition for the term retirement. So our core priorities, what are they? How much does it cost? When do we want to achieve it by? Our preference-based priorities are the things unique to you, the things that you want. The second house, the cars, the vacation property, paying for your kids' weddings, so on and so forth. No right or wrong, it's whatever you want. So we have to get those down compiled so we actually know what we're trying to get closer to, right? That's commandment number 1, closer to. If we just compile and we build something but we don't know what we're trying to get closer to, we might actually build a system that gets us further away. So we need to always go back to what are we trying to get closer to. We do this in every decision that we make in the businesses we run together and in the businesses that we each run separately. We're also coming back to, is this going to get me closer? If not, I'm just not going to do it, because why would I intentionally opt in to something that's going to get me further away? That would seem sort of like, I don't know, masochistic behavior. So we need to get those things compiled so we know our current position. Then we assign the data from the last 12 months into 6 or less categories. I gave you 6 examples: your home expenses, entertainment, fun, kids, travel, investments. Maybe you can get it down to 3 or 4. But we're just going through and we're saying, oh, that's a home expense. That's an entertainment. That's fun. You're going to go through it and you're going to want to start creating all these other different categories. Oh, well, that's home, but really we should have a separate category for utilities. You know what you're doing in that case? You're trying to maximize. You're trying to have the most. You're getting too detailed. You're going to end up in analysis paralysis, and the outcome is going to be something you can't actually execute on because there's too much data. So you're going to have to keep fighting the desire to maximize and have all of these subcategories, right? 6 or less. Ideally 3 or 4, if possible. And we're grouping them into categories basically based off risk buckets. So we're going to go through and we're just going to quickly, oh, that's home, oh, that's entertainment, that's fun, that's kids, that's travel. We're not spending a lot of time going, oh, I can't believe we spent so much. Oh, we need to cut that one. That's not what we're doing in this phase. That's a step much later in the re-engineering of your cash flow, but we're not doing that now. Because once we go through this exercise, we're going to assume the previous 12 months is our baseline for spending going forward. We're going to assume. Now, you have an anecdote on the fitness side of things that I think is a good one, and you posted about it in sort of preparation of today's meeting. I can give some other examples. There's a reason why we start with the baseline, and it has to do with setting ourselves up for a win now and long term.
Yeah, I think it's this is what I want to harp on today, because there's a lot of suggestions, algorithms, profit first, budget 2.0 app, all these things, right? And it's important to realize that what you are doing currently has to be the baseline. So I talk about it, fitness and nutrition, and you say, hey, how many calories should I eat, or how many days should I work out? And the truth is, instead of I know I should have done better, or I know I should have spent less, your preferences, the way that you lived your life over the last 12 months, it's really custom to you. And so you might go to Profit First or some budgeting app, and it says, oh, you got to put 10% toward travel and 5% towards this. Completely arbitrary, right? But we're talking about your life, the things you prefer, getting closer to things that matter to you. So if you live with your parents and you love to travel, those percentages are going to be a little bit different, right? And if you just take them from some book or otherwise, oh, well, I'm supposed to spend this much on travel, I'm supposed to spend this much on food or whatever, you end up so far off of what feels right to you that it just falls apart, which is that chaos, rigidity. So it's called, in fitness, from my friend Dr. Kashi, we call it the science of hindsight. The best way to really build any strategy to achieve anything is to compile the last 12 months, or as far back as you can, and then you just kind of average it out and start there, right? So the flip side is if you work out 0 days a week, and you read a book that says you should work out 5, and you try 5 instead of using 0 as your baseline, the likelihood of something bad happening, like you quitting or getting hurt, is very, very high. So this is the point that I was hoping to harp on personally today, is just that look back without any judgment. Should have, like you said, should have spent less. Oh, I got to do better, and just really get a look at what your behavior actually tells you about yourself, right? And then you start building the strategy moving forward from there.
The end goal is to reduce risk. So if we go from 0 to 10 and then we go back to 3, that's an incredible amount of volatility. Mm-hmm. Volatility is an indicator of risk. The probability that something bad is going to happen, meaning the probability is you're going to go back to 0. So we need to actually make incremental shifts to remove adding substantial amount of volatility. That's really kind of said in maybe a more technical way, but ultimately going from 0 to 5 or 0 to 50, or I'm going to work out every day after I've done none, is the amount of volatility you've added, meaning the probability of you not continuing really, really high. And that's just math, right? Mm-hmm. It's just statistics. It applies in every domain, right? So we want to assume that our current spending is our baseline. From there, we can automate. So we're going to take those buckets divided by the number of pay periods. So each bucket, what is the annual amount divided by 24? We're going to set up individual bank accounts for each of those buckets, and then we're going to have direct deposits into those, meaning our money, our paycheck or draw is going to automatically go into those buckets based off a straight line amount. Now so for some accounts, we may be building up a cushion because vacation might be one of your buckets. And this year, COVID, you might not be, maybe didn't go on any vacations. So it's building up. Or maybe you go on vacation once a year or a couple of times a year. And so sometimes you have a lot in that balance. Sometimes you have a little, based off kind of how recently you went on vacation. But we're paying ourselves into these different buckets because then we've evened out our expenses. So we know exactly how much should go into savings or go into investments because we've straight lined the expenses by annualizing it and then allocating into these different buckets. There's something called the mental accounting bias. It's based off of real neuroscience. You can Google it and hear all about it. We talk about it again in the cash flow engineering series. But simply by dividing your money into risk buckets gets you 80+% of the way there, if not closer to 100%. It's kind of like how laying down in bed gets you something like 70 to 80% of the benefit of sleep. Now, I tried to find the specific study behind that statement. So if someone wants to fact check me and say I don't think that's true, go right ahead. But the point still remains that we're front loading it. Trying to build an elaborate budget is going from like 0 to 100, and the probability of you not implementing it and maintaining it super high because it's not preventative, it's detective. You have to find out whether or not you're spending an appropriate amount. You're not opting in, right? So you're maximizing. So by opting in, this is the way that it works, is that if you go to spend your fun account and your fun account is 0, your credit card gets rejected. Then what you have to do is opt in to transferring money to your fun account, right? So the idea here is that we're straightening out our expenses, flatlining it, putting it into these buckets so we know exactly how much is going to go into savings or investment. And then because we have these individual accounts, now the Certainty app will also allow you to do virtualized accounts if you don't want to open all the individual buckets. But because we have these individualized accounts, we are forced to opt in to overfunding it if we're spending too much. So if the fund account is at zero, we have to decide to transfer money into the fund account. If the travel account is zero and we want to go on a trip, we have to opt in to funding that account. So doesn't mean you won't still do it. You can override the system, right? Collusion. So in corporate finance, fraud occurs. You can't when there's collusion, meaning you could have all these separations of duty and preventative controls, but if everyone decides to collude and override those controls, then you have fraud. You can collude with yourself or your spouse and decide to override the controls that you put in place, right? But nonetheless, you still have to have that conversation because we've set up the system in a way that's forcing us to make a decision about it. So we've straight-lined our expenses, we've set up the individual bank accounts, we've set up the money to flow in so that we're paying ourselves into these buckets, and now we know exactly how much we should be putting into savings. And if there's anything less than that each month, then we go and say, what happened? Why do we have less? And the chances are you already know because you opted in. You kept opting in. If you keep opting in, that's an issue you have to wrangle with yourself about espouse values versus values in action. The things you say are important versus the things that you're actually doing. Again, we talk about that a bunch in the course. So this is the upfront heavy lifting, the optimizing. Now, maximizing, how do we cut the expenses? How do we keep more? We've got to be really strategic about doing that. That happens after we put the system in place. See, everyone wants to strategize and execute before they actually compile and analyze. It's the case framework. You all want to just do some stuff and have a bunch of money. I just went Southern for some reason. I have no idea why, because I'm from Seattle. But you all want to do some stuff and just execute or just strategize. But you don't want to know what your current position is and actually analyze it and know the trends. We're just making stuff up and hoping that it works. But we know about the people who consistently win. What do? They have a methodology. They have a toolkit. They know their biases. They're playing their game. They're not making stuff up on the fly and hoping that it works. One of our other commandments talks exactly about this around how to make bets, asymmetric bets. So that's the system. And you might go, oh, well, there's not. That's pretty simple. Yeah, it's supposed to be. That's the point. If it's hard, then it's a budget. You're not going to do it because you don't have the time because you're maximizing.
And the reality with a budget, it's the same with a diet or a business plan or whatever, is if you project and you guess, right, we forget that we're guessing. Once we write it down, we're like, that's our budget. You know, we forget that like we kind of made some of this stuff up because it sounded good. What this does, this framework, which is dynamic, it's the dynamic bank accounts, is by having you opt in. If you come in short, right, there's a really tight feedback loop. Say, why were we short? Oh, that's right, I opted into this. And you have, like Dan said, you have an opportunity to update the system, which a budget doesn't necessarily give you. It's a little, especially if there's a lot of volatility in the expenses. So it is a opportunity, it is a system that allows you to update it over time so that, like we talked about in the beginning, the system produces the outcome we want instead of looking at the budget going, I'll do better next time. No, I'll do better next time. F it, this budget sucks.
Yeah.
It's dynamic in the sense that it is, because it's in one of the wealth commandments too, is that, or one of the 3 reasons people win is they have a different toolbox, right? But they're always updating it. And they're updating it so that the system is more likely to deliver the output that they want. That's what this does that a budget or some plan you print off the internet doesn't do for you.
That's right. Yeah, and this is the system that I use with my wife, and I wish I implemented it when we got married rather than 3 or 4 years ago or whenever it was, because neither one of us wants to parent the other person. I don't want to say, no, you can't buy this. Ask me for permission for whether or not you can buy something. She has a fund account. I have a fund account. It all goes in there. We have a kids account, right? And so we've aligned based off our spending patterns. We've aligned on what the annual amount is, and so it goes in evenly throughout the year. If for some reason we're overspending there, then we have to have a conversation at that point. But we're not having these individual micromanaged level conversations on, oh, she wants a pair of shoes, can she get a pair of shoes? I don't have those conversations anymore because she's got her own fund account, I have my own fund account, right? And so it's setting up the system in the upfront so that we've minimized the amount of individual conversations that we need to have. And now she doesn't feel like I'm parenting her. I don't feel like she's parenting me. It's operating on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, and then on at least annually we look at it and kind of reassess. Typically, we talk about doing cash flow engineering with some regularity for your business, at least quarterly, which is a good dovetail into what we're teaching live right now. This was a sliver. We spent a lot more time on the wealth commandments, a lot more time on the biases, and just the underlying system for processing these preference-based decisions to get you closer to the things you want. So we're teaching it live right now. It's a 6+ week program. We're a couple weeks in. Everything is professionally edited, archived, so on and so forth. So you can jump in right now. Cash Flow Engineering Live, our masterclass. It's probably the single best piece of content that I've put together, and it's a culmination of like 20 years of research around uncertainty. So we teach it live. There's weekly trainings with slides like this. We're sitting in our studio on the couch, just like we are today, with slides like this, graphs, resources, workbooks, all the things that I use in my businesses that I help our clients implement that work with us at a one-on-one level. So weekly trainings, Q&As, ongoing support. I'm regularly get on one-on-one calls with folks and show them how to do stuff that's in the weeds on their specific business. So you get all that. Nick, do you want to talk about what we're doing for people who've tuned in?
Yeah. If you, it's going to be cfeclass.com, right there, /no budget. And it is right now, it's a ridiculous price because we're trying to get help as many people as possible. And just a little background, people always see me as the marketing guy, and I sent an email about this. I refuse to detach the marketing and the more mindset from cash flow engineering, because you have a massive advantage on the marketing side if you have this in your business for many reasons. So we're trying to get as many people as possible because it helps me help them even more. But you go cfeclass.com /no budget. Right now it's $590, 2 payments of $597. Obviously, if you got in early, like always, you got a discount from that. You can go right now, enter, I think it's no budget, all lowercase. You get $200 off each payment, so it drops it down to $397 by 2. If you've been in our stuff before, you know that as this goes on, Dan gets ideas, I get ideas. We're already teaching a live class, so what we do is we just kind of take these things and add them as bonuses. So most of the big bonuses come sometime in the middle of the live classes because we realize that we can add some value. So cfeclass.com /no budget. That'll take you to a page that I threw up real quick right before this. And the coupon code no budget will give you $200 off each of your payments to make it $397 by 2. And like Dan said, if you're in the live class and you get stuck on something, either one of us will typically hop on a call and help you sort through it really quickly. Hopefully we see you guys live, Cash Flow Engineering. Even if you can't make it live, it's every Thursday. You still get support, still get some access, you still get all the recordings, all the workbooks and everything. So hopefully we see some of you guys in there.